This video was brought to you by NordVPN. With the new agreement on Northern Ireland and the lockdown files filling the news at the moment, it's easy for other important developments to pass you by. But there are always lots of things going on in Westminster, and one of the things rumbling on behind the scenes is the passage of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. This is the Conservatives' attempt to translate their election slogan of levelling up the country into something more tangible. Now, this is an absolutely mammoth bill, and obviously we won't be able to cover everything in this video. But in this video, we'll try and explain the main parts of the bill and whether it's likely to succeed in getting through Parliament anytime soon. So, let's start this video by taking a look at the contents of the bill, and then we'll move on to some of the criticisms of it. Now, the white paper on levelling up was first introduced on the 2nd of February 2022 by the Department for Levelling Up. At the time, the government described the bill as a moral, social and economic programme for the whole government, with this programme itself containing 12 missions, which are designed to be achieved by 2030. And these 12 missions include everything from increasing pay and reducing crime, to improving well-being and creating London-style public transport across the UK. But fortunately, the missions are organised into 4 focus areas. The first one is to boost productivity, pay, jobs and living standards. The second is to spread opportunity and improve public services. The third is to restore a sense of community, local pride and belonging. And the fourth is to empower local leaders and communities. Now, as the government sets itself a target of meeting all 12 missions by 2030, they've also introduced a mechanism in the bill that requires them to provide annual updates on their progress. Additionally, the government gives themselves the power to change metrics, target dates, and most controversially, the missions themselves. Now, it's not yet clear how likely it is the government will change the missions themselves in the future, although it appears that if they fail to meet one of the missions, it won't be all that hard for them to simply cancel it in retrospect, especially because they actively gave themselves the power to do so. Anyway, clearly these missions aren't the most watertight, but let's get into some of the more specific changes this bill hopes to make. There are 2 main changes, one on councils and one on planning. Let's look at those in turn. One of the biggest changes that the bill tries to make is creating something called combined county authorities. Basically, creating a new type of combined authority. Now, without getting too deep into the specifics of how local politics works, some councils in the country are unitary, i.e. one tier, and some are tiered. And since 2009, councils have been able to form so-called combined authorities, where local councils basically agree to work together. The thing is that in 2-tiered councils, the upper and lower tiers need to consent to join. However, this new combined county authority is a grouping of only the upper tiers. Now, naturally, the district councils network hit back against this plan, saying that it would strain relations in 2-tier county areas. Now, in the government's explanatory notes, they explain that this would actually enable devolution in areas with 2-tiered governments. Anyway, another key change in the bill relates more specifically to planning. For example, it changes compulsory purchase rules in such a way that it would speed up projects where this instrument is required. That's because currently, if the government needs to buy some land off someone in order to complete a government project, then they can issue a compulsory purchase order. Now, there are some checks on the government here that we don't have time to get into. But basically, if someone objects, then they can hold a public inquiry. These changes, though, mean that the Secretary of State will be able to decide whether or not an inquiry is even held. Effectively, it takes away the legal right to an inquiry, with the government arguing that this will increase efficiency. The bill also introduces a street vote system, which means that local residents will have the power to propose new developments and hold votes on whether planning permission is granted to new builds in their area. Similarly, local areas will be required to introduce a design code, which should better inform planning decisions. The idea then is that these new changes will give local areas more control over how developers change their local area. Additionally, a new infrastructure levy is set to be introduced, which developers will have to pay to cover new infrastructure projects. Now, this levy is charged on the value of properties when sold by developers, although the exact rate is set by local planning authorities. So, those are some of the main changes set to happen in the first phase of this plan. Now, the bill has actually received quite a lot of criticism already, because one of the main ideas that the government had attached to the idea of levelling up is regional inequality. So it would be reasonably assumed that a bill sharing the name of levelling up would have something in it to address regional inequality. And to be fair, this is an important issue. It does seem that regional inequality is something that needs addressing in the UK. For instance, the ONS came up with a productivity index, which measures income in a certain region compared to productivity. Positive scores indicate that an area has high income and low productivity, while negative scores indicate that an area has low income and high productivity. As you can see, areas in the south tend to have positive values, whereas areas in the north have negative ones. But despite it being a very real issue, the only mention of regional inequality in the bill is the requirement for the government to set medium-term missions and report annually on their progress. That implies then that the 12 missions we mentioned earlier will in and of themselves address regional inequality. But not everyone's convinced by this argument. The Institute for Government argues that annual reporting alone will not be sufficient to ensure that the missions drive the policy as intended. Separately, they argue that of the 12 missions we spoke about earlier, 5 are not ambitious enough, 3 are too ambitious to be realistic, 4 don't specify what success looks like, 2 have too narrow a focus, and 1 just doesn't align with the overall objectives. And this kind of criticism is fairly mild when you compare it to other people's critiques. For instance, when the bill was going through the Commons, Labour's Levelling Up Housing, Communities and Local Government Shadow Secretary, Lisa Nandy, argued that the bill allowed the government to tear up their missions on a whim, and that the bill was more aimed at dealing with housing and planning than on levelling up democracy and devolution. The SNP spokesperson, Patricia Gibson, said something similar, saying that the government had given themselves the power to move the goalposts and change targets that look like they won't be met. While in the Lords, Baroness Sue Hayman summed up the bill as a strange mishmash, a Christmas tree bill on that anyone can hang anything on. So, while the bill does appear to address some of the bureaucracy surrounding planning and development, it's still a bit of a strange bill that tries to change a little about a lot. And despite the government's talk for years about the problems related to regional inequality, it seems that this bill doesn't really do all that much to address it, or even deliver on the promise of levelling up. A couple of years ago, I was a victim of identity theft, and I only found out when a letter from the court came through my door saying that I owed a bunch of money to a broadband company for an address I'd never even lived at. After a bunch of legal back and forth, I was forced to pay the money that I allegedly owed just to try and make the problem go away. But from then on, I was determined to make sure that I wasn't caught out again. And as such, I took a number of steps, including signing up for NordVPN. Now, you surely already know that NordVPN is the world's fastest virtual private network. But you might not know that they have a whole suite of threat protection features too. In fact, NordVPN's threat protection shields you from all kinds of dangerous things online, blocking malware, trackers, and malicious ads to help prevent you from falling victim to any of these scams or phishing attacks. Not only that, they also have a dark web monitoring service. So even if your data were to fall into the wrong hands, they'd scour the dark web to notify you when someone shares, leaks, or sells your details. Hopefully meaning that you'd find out what was going on before a court order lands on your doorstep. Now, ultimately, this isn't a fun thing to think about, but trust me, it's a whole lot less fun when it becomes a reality. Also, it's not just other people that this happens to. I hope you'll agree that I'm a reasonably smart person, and I did a computer science degree, and I still got. So, click the link in the description or go to nordvpn.com/TLDR to get a huge discount on their 2-year plan. And with a 30-day money-back guarantee, you've got nothing to lose. So, thanks for your support, and make sure you click the link in the description.